Welcome everyone to the GBV Community of Practice webinar that we're doing in co-host with the Interagency Minimum Standards Task Force. Thank you very much and welcome, and we're glad that you're able to join us. Today we're going to have interpretation. Sarah Cornish, you want to speak in a little bit and help people with that?
Sure, just to check that everyone can see that there's a choice at the bottom of your screen to choose interpretation. There are 4 channels. I just added the description in the chat. Unfortunately, Zoom doesn't allow us to have an Arabic channel, so please choose Japanese for Arabic. Sorry about that.
Okay, great.
Any problems with the interpretation, please let us know, and don't hesitate to write in the chat if we're speaking too fast.
And thanks so much to all of our interpreters for helping us do this webinar in the different languages. We want to make it as accessible to everyone. All right, as we get ready to start, I wanted to first say a few words about who we are for those of you who aren't familiar. My name is Sarah Martin, and I am with the GBV AOR Community of Practice. So what is exactly the GBV AOR Community of Practice? So what we are is a virtual space for ongoing field-centered learning for those people working on GBV and emergencies. We currently have over 800 GBV specialists from around the world in our community, and we're a virtual platform for both learners and experienced specialists to discuss challenges and troubleshoot solutions to their work. We provide a place for our members to get support from their peers, to share new resources, to brainstorm solutions to common GBV program-related problems, for instance, like transitioning from in-person GBV case management response to going online during the COVID pandemic. You can get a lot of our materials that our members share on the GBV AOR website, and we'll be putting that information in the chat box for you. We also work really closely with the GBV AOR help desk that lets members get in touch with a specialist when they need additional support. And again, keep an eye on the chat box because we'll continue to put information up there so that you have access to it. So one of the key things that we do is we bring together specialists to address key topics like in this webinar. We highlight resources like the Interagency GBV minimum standards to make sure that everyone in the community can benefit from learning. So if you're interested in joining the GBV Community of Practice and you're a practitioner, get in touch with us. You can send us an email at gbvcop@gmail.com or just log into the GBV AOR website and you can find us there and get support. So that's who we are, and we're doing this webinar in combination with the Minimum Standards Task Force. On that note, I'd like to turn it over to Jennifer Chase of the GBV AOR to say a few words.
Hi everyone, this is Jennifer Chase, GBV AOR coordinator, and I just want to say we're super excited about the webinar today and about the minimum standards. We started this process in June 2018, and at that time I was kind of hoping that we would end up with 16 minimum standards so that we could launch them on the 16 days of activism. And it turned out to happen that way. So we're very excited. I have every year been requested from our field coordinators and other field staff, what is the central theme this year for 16 days? And we haven't actually ever had our own theme. So this year, it's very exciting that we are able to share the minimum standards as the central theme, and that it crosses across all humanitarian settings. So for IDPs, refugees, and migrants, and you're going to hear more about that. But we hope that you will find it extremely relevant to your work. And also, we are just now launching the Facilitators Guide and the Contextualization Tool, which you're going to hear about during the webinar, to help you implement the minimum standards. And I want to just give a shout out and a thank you to the 3 co-facilitators, UNFPA, UNICEF, and IRC, as well as our speakers today from UNHCR, IOM, and Trocaire, and of course to Sarah Martin for the community of practice support, and Sarah Cornish, who really made this accessible by finding different languages so that we can really reach the different regions in the world. So very excited, and welcome everyone, and thank you very much.
Okay, so without further ado, we'd like to go ahead and launch into the webinar. What we're going to be doing today, you can see here on the agenda, we're going to introduce the minimum standards and then talk about the facilitation guide, and then give you some information on how you can use the minimum standards yourself in different things. And then we'll do a question and answer session. So please feel free to write your questions in the chat box, and we'll be monitoring the chat box to be able to put the questions to our different panelists after this. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Emilie.
Thanks, Sarah.
Can you
mute your mic? Someone is unmuted. Thank you all for joining today. I'm really pleased that we're actually launching or having this webinar sort of on the 1-year anniversary of the launch of the minimum standards. So I'm hoping that a lot on the line have some experience with the minimum standards. But if you don't, that's okay. This is a great time to really sort of integrate it into your work and into your organization. Next slide. We've done a presentation and orientation on the minimum standards a number of times before. So we're going to sort of speed through the next few slides as a group, me and my task team co-chairs. But if you have any questions on it, of course, we can circle back during Q&A time. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the process for developing the minimum standards. And this is actually what's up on the slide right now. It's actually only sort of like the second phase. We did before what's up here in 2017 have a diagnostic phase where we held, I think it was 11 field consultations to really know what niche we were filling and to really sort of define the need for the minimum standards so that the product would really sort of fit the need and be most useful to those doing the GBV and emergencies work. So we had, as Jennifer noted, a global meeting in June 2018. This was the task team and GBV AOR members, and we really met to define the scope and the structure, define sort of what those 16 buckets of minimum standards were going to be and what we were going to put in those buckets and the key actions, and we really tried to flesh out those minimum standards. And then after that, we also had a survey that went out to a range of people, asking them what they wanted to see, what they wanted to focus on. And after that, we had a full draft that was reviewed by a number of people in the task team and beyond. And with the full draft, we sent it out to 14 different countries. And thank you to all of those who were part of those field consultations. We had about 14 settings where they reviewed either half the text or the whole text. And we also shared it with other experts. And that feedback was so valuable for us and really informed the next draft and the final, what went in the final document. It's just, so important to say that this was really a fully consultative process, had so many diverse voices from the field. And, we tried our best to include everything. And I think, where we landed was, such a good place where we could really define, what it was that we wanted GBV actors to achieve within these 16 standards. We're still working on translating the Arabic, but the minimum standards are available in French and Spanish. And we have a rollout plan, and the Facilitators Guide is sort of the first big piece of that rollout strategy that we'll be launching this week, and you'll hear more about today. But yeah, so it was just, the product of so many voices, and we like to say that we have, I think, at least a century of experience behind the minimum standards. Next slide. So before we dig deep into the content of the interagency minimum standards, I just wanted to take a moment to sort of step back and really locate it within sort of the resources that are available, sort of like the three main resources for GBV and emergencies work. I'm not saying these are the only resources, because of course there's the case management guidelines and other pieces as well, but these are three resources that I think sometimes people confuse. And it's great if you're out there and if you don't confuse it, but just wanted to step back and see how these fit in. So I'm going to start with the resource on the left, the Handbook for Coordinating Gender-Based Violence in Emergencies. The primary purpose of this is for coordination. The primary audience is GBV coordinators. And then also it might also help those who are working in, as part of coordination bodies. The minimum standards also speak to coordination in standard 15, but it's not a handbook for coordination. And then also the one on the right is the guidelines for integrating GBV interventions in humanitarian settings. And the primary audience for this is not GBV specialists, although GBV specialists do work across sectors to make sure that GBV risk mitigation is mainstreamed. So the primary audience for this are sector leads and really all humanitarian actors, so that they can incorporate GBV prevention and mitigation into sector-specific interventions. So that primary audience of that are not GBV actors, which gets us to the interagency minimum standards, which presents 16 minimum standards for GBV prevention and response programming. So this speaks directly to GBV specialized actors and their partners. Obviously, this could be government. This could be local civil society and women's-led and women's rights organizations. UN agencies and other INGOs. So this speaks to those who are implementing GBV specialized programming. So hopefully that you will not confuse these and help others in your office, because I know some people in my office sometimes refer to these interchangeably, whether they mean to or not. It's really good to just sort of know the difference of these and know which one you're referring to. So I know the one on the right is usually referred to the GBV guidelines, but that is for the non-GBV specialists, and the one on the left is more for coordination. And then we're talking about the one in the middle, which is focused on GBV response and prevention programming. Next.
Next slide. Yeah. Hi, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So what are the GBV minimum standards? I think Emilie has covered quite a few of the key points around why they were developed and who the target audience is. They were really put together to define what agencies and actors need to do to prevent and respond to GBV, but they are minimum standards. So they don't provide a comprehensive guidance to all of these areas of programming, hence some of the other resources that Emilie referred to. They are based on field-informed experiences over a century, as somebody once calculated, as well as evidence in what we know about the current state of GBV programming. So, we did try to really ground them in the best practice that we know of. They are universal standards. Of course, it's a resource that we hope anyone can pick up in any situation. So they do need to be contextualized. And we're very lucky to have Inbal with us, who will talk us through the contextualization tool in a little bit. At the heart of the minimum standards is recognizing women and girls' participation and partnership, and that we cannot do any good GBV programming if we don't work together with them. And of course, it aligns with existing tools. It does not seek to duplicate other tools, but really bring what the minimum is for each of these programming areas. Of course, as I said, it needs to be contextualized. It's not a one-size-fits-all manual. And it is really trying to bring in what, as a community, that we need to do to make sure that our programming is safe and of quality. It does include women and girls who face different barriers to access. For example, women and girls with disabilities, who are LBT, older, adolescents, etc. and really puts women's empowerment at the heart of all we do. Next slide. So there are 16 GBV minimum standards in beautiful colors on your screen to make it easy. The 3 green standards are foundational standards. These are standards that cannot be compromised on. These are standards that anyone implementing whatever piece of a GBV program need to follow throughout implementation. And these are the GBV guiding principles, which of course all of you are experts on. Safety, confidentiality, respect for survivors, non-discrimination, staff care and support that we talk a lot about, but seldom put enough resources and attention to, as well as I just mentioned, participation, empowerment of women and girls. Now, these standards are standards in of themselves. Sorry, that was a bit of an English glitch. But they are also standards that need to inform and suffuse all of the others as we work. The gray or purple standards are the program standards. There are 10 of them. And as you see, they cover really the heart of our programs. We're looking at healthcare for GBV survivors, case management for GBV survivors, referral systems. These are all things that all of you experts on the call have already done in some shape or form. And perhaps you're not doing all of this.
A little bit slower, please.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So perhaps you're not doing all of these standards, but if you're doing one of these, so if you're doing healthcare for GBV survivors, then you should be looking at what the minimum standard of quality is. And then the orange standards represent the process standards, where we have collection and use of GBV survivor data, monitoring, evaluation, and assessment, and GBV coordination, as Emilie mentioned previously. And those are 16 minimum standards. Next slide. So what do we mean by a minimum standard? The standards taken together outline common agreement on what needs to be achieved so that we reach adequate quality. What do we mean by adequate quality? That it does no harm and reflects good practice. It took us a while to get to that, and many other minimum standards have not defined this. So it's really important that this is how we defined it. Each standard represents a common agreement on what needs to be achieved to reach that adequate quality. Can you do more? Yes, of course you can, but you should at least be able to reach adequate quality. Not every GBV actor has to do all of the standards, but if you take on a programmatic component, then you should be reaching adequate quality. And of course, you don't need to do all 16 areas of programming, but we consider that a holistic quality GBV program would at some point do some of those 16 standards. Over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Catherine. Hi, everybody. Can we have the next slide? Thanks. Great. So as we all know, the GBV minimum standards are founded on gender equality. So as you'll see across the GBV minimum standards, and as Catherine highlighted, as foundational women and girls participation and empowerment, we know that we want to focus our GBV specialized programming on meeting the needs of women and girls who experience violence, addressing their subordination to men and boys, and that we also want to be inclusive of male survivors of sexual assault and make sure that we work together with child protection to meet the needs of child survivors. Next slide. So for those of you that have your GBV minimum standards open, you'll see that for each of the standards, there's a similar structure. We start with an introduction, defining what the standard means, and then move into key actions, which outline all of the key actions we need to take to achieve the standard. There are suggested indicators for each standard. And then where we found that there were critical issues that needed to be unpacked in a little bit more detail, there are guidance notes which help you to further understand some of the important issues which we need to address to achieve the standard. And then we come to tools and resources. So as Emilie mentioned, There's so many existing guidelines and training tools and resources that are part of our GBV specialized programming work. And the minimum standards really just bring those together. So this tools and resources section is very important. So for example, for GBV case management, you'll see an overview in the standard itself of everything we want to do to achieve GBV case management, that you don't walk away having read that standard with an ability to deliver quality GBV case management. For that, you would turn to the GBV case management guidelines and training toolkit listed in the resources. Next slide. So here's an example of the key actions. All of these need to be contextualized, and of course this isn't exhaustive, but here are some of the major activities that we need to be thinking about. Next slide. So we're currently in the middle of trying to roll out the GBV minimum standards. We owe a big thank you to UNHCR for the work funding the facilitation guide and contextualization tool, which Inbal is about to walk us through, and for the translation. We've got fellow agencies here with us today, including Trocaire, and Fiona is going to speak in a bit, who have been leading on the M&E framework, as well as all the Riga and local national and regional GBV subcluster members who are rolling out the minimum standards through working group activities. But there's more to do. So we are raising funds, we are looking for organizational champions, and we're keen to hear from everybody in the discussion session today. What do you need to roll out the minimum standards in your context? Next slide, and I'll hand over to the author of the GBV minimum standards, Inbal Sansani.
Hello, everyone. We've just been talking about the interagency GBV minimum standards, and I'm going to speak about the Facilitators Guide to the GBV minimum standards. The Facilitators Guide is a bridge toward applying the minimum standards that we have been discussing, specifically to your programming context. Next slide. The GBV, the Facilitators Guide, is split up into two parts that work together. So in order to apply the minimum standards, we need to first understand the concepts included in the minimum standards so that we can have a greater sense of how to apply them to our individual context. So the Facilitators Guide is set up to equip a diverse range of actors who are supporting, or planning to implement GBV specialized programs. So one part, which is focused on understanding, is so that we can get really familiar with the content. And then the next part provides a process for assessing how the GBV minimum standards are currently being implemented in your specific context. So the aim of the Facilitators Guide is to gain an applied understanding of the GBV minimum standards, meaning how do we apply this to our own work, enhance confidence to take the actions that are appropriate to achieve the standards in your context, and also to assess current programming to best to understand where there may be strengths and where there may be gaps according to international best practice and the guidance that's formulated in the minimum standards themselves. So because there are two parts here, one important suggestion is that to really take time to understand the content and to work with the material in the facilitator's guide before getting into the application part, so that whoever you're working with on the minimum standards in your context, whoever you're learning this with, that you have a common understanding so that you can also do the contextualization work together. Next slide. So the facilitator's guide, like I was saying, is for a wide range of actors. We mentioned that the GBV, the interagency GBV minimum standards, were for actors who do GBV specialized programming. The facilitator's guide is intended for a wider range of actors and agencies who would like to understand and apply GBV programming components and standards better. So this can include, of course, actors who actually implement GBV program, and also women's rights organizations, government partners, and humanitarian actors that also work on GBV specialized programming as part of their other work. So for example, actors who are in the health, rule of law, or livelihood sectors who support women and girls through their other sectoral work. This is also helpful for organizations who support women and girls who are at a greater risk of GBV, including girls with disabilities, older women, adolescent girls, and women with diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. We suggest that in terms of the facilitator, for the facilitator's guide, that it's important that the person facilitating has experience with GBV programming in emergencies, and that this person is also familiar with the interagency GBV minimum standards. And we suggest that when you go through the facilitator's guide, that you start with the introduction to the PowerPoint, and then look at the foundational standards that were mentioned earlier. The foundational standards are standards 1 through 3, the GBV guiding principles, women's and girls' participation and empowerment, and staff care and support. Next slide, please. I think, can we actually skip this one, just in terms of time? Great. So to get into the facilitator's guide, I explained that we've split it up into two parts, understanding and applying. So the first part is focused on understanding the concepts. So you have the GBV minimum standards. In the facilitator's guide, we provide an explanation of the main concepts for each standard. So it's a summary. There are 16 chapters in the facilitator's guide, like there are 16 minimum standards. So for each standard, we provide two things. One is a PowerPoint presentation that presents the concepts. Again, it's a summary of the standard. And then for each standard, we provide 3 to 5 exercises that are based on either the concepts or common programming challenges. And these exercises highlight the key concepts and actions for each standard. So many of these exercises, most of them were designed for in-person activities, but they can be adapted to online learning options. Next slide, please. So we've been speaking so far about the facilitator, the first part of the facilitator's guide, which is focused on understanding the minimum standards. Can you actually go back one slide, please? So in whatever process you are undertaking in your setting, we suggest that you can use the facilitator's guide in different settings. So you can use them with your own team to better understand GBV concepts and how your own programming is doing. You can work on the facilitator's guide in your area with other actors who are involved in GBV programming. You can use the facilitator's guide with other NGOs. You can use it with perhaps some of the funders that you work with any of your partners, so that everyone has a similar understanding of the type of GBV programming that should be taking place in your setting. So once you are together, either with your team or with a broader network of other providers and other actors in your setting, to work on the facilitator's guide together to understand the concepts. So then once everyone has a similar understanding of the minimum standards, then we will go to part 2. So next slide, please. So after there's a common understanding of the minimum standards or specific standards that you'd like to focus on in your setting, then you can begin to use the contextualization tool. So I mentioned that the facilitator's guide is split up into understanding the minimum standards and then applying them. The contextualization tool is the tool that we are offering for use for applying the minimum standards. So as we mentioned earlier, the minimum standards need to be contextualized. They need to be adapted and applied to each particular setting. So we set up a process, a 4-part process here for assessing, for contextualizing the minimum standards. So let's go on to the next slide where the process will be clearer. So the reason for contextualizing is that we have the minimum standards and we want to ensure that they are implemented to the extent possible in your setting. So when we are working on contextualizing together, either with our own teams or with partners, we are working toward GBV programming that is survivor-centered, that has adequate quality, and that is actually responsive to the specific context. When we work together on this with our team members and with other practitioners and activists in our setting, we're also through the process helping to build a strong community of actors who are committed to delivering safe and quality and accountable GBV services. Next slide. So contextualization means that we are looking for how to look at the strengths in our own programming, any gaps that we have in our own programming, in the quality, so that we work toward implementing programs that are not only safe, but also in line with the GBV guiding principles. When we implement programs, when we are contextualizing the minimum standards, we're also helping to ensure that our programming does not cause harm. Contextualization also means that we look at the program components that we're currently implementing and we look at the minimum standards and can have an analysis of how our specific work is, how it relates to the minimum standards, so we can tell where there may be gaps and where we may want to focus our time and our energy and our financial resources. So contextualizing doesn't mean a certain standard, doesn't mean that you're prioritizing it or that it is more important. It simply means that it's one of the programming components that you're working on, that you'd like to see how you're performing that based on the minimum standards and where you could improve in your current work. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that there is a 4-step process, and the tool will be on the next page. But basically, when we contextualize, so you'll go through a process of, for example, if you're looking at standard 6, case management, you'll go through the PowerPoint, you'll do some of the exercises with your group or your team, you'll get a sense of what the concepts mean and what it means to implement case management according to the minimum standards. Then you'll arrive at the contextualization tool. Let's actually go to the next slide so we can see what the tool looks like. Next slide, please. Great, so this is the contextualization tool. You'll see at the top that there are 4 columns. Go back one, please. Go back one slide, please.
Sorry, I'm on the slide for contextualizing with the 4 columns. Maybe
Yes,
there's a
great.
delay.
Yeah, no, yeah, I think there is. Thank you. So there are 4 steps for contextualizing a standard. The first step is to look at how the minimum standard is currently being implemented in your context. So for each of these, you'll receive a tool with all of the minimum standards. In this case, we're looking at case management, and there are specific questions for each standard. So the first question is, how is this being applied in your specific country or in your field setting? So you're looking at your own work, and you're looking at the minimum standards. You're looking at all of the actions that you're doing really well. You're looking to see if there may be any gaps between how the standard is currently being implemented and how it should be implemented. You're identifying some of the barriers between your current work and the minimum standards. In the next stage of the contextualization process, you're looking at the key actions that can help you bridge the gap between where you may be currently and the minimum standards. So you're considering what actions, for example, for case management, what actions can you take? Maybe what actions can you improve? What actions can you sustain, continue doing, so that you are more in line with the standard? The next part 3 of contextualizing each standard is to look at the folks and the tools and the resources that can help you to get from where you are right now to the level of the standard. So who are partners that you can work with? Are there any trainings available? Are there practitioners who can come support you and your team or support others in the broader setting? So then the final stage of contextualization is planning. Once you've identified the gaps, Once you've seen your strengths and what you'd like to continue, once you've identified what other key actions you may want to take and the resources and people who are available to you, then the last stage of contextualization is planning for when you will do the identified actions in order to get the programming to the level or closer to the level of the standard. Next slide. So I will skip these because we just spoke about them in detail, and so that we have more space for questions. Each of these slides break down the 4 different steps of contextualization. Next slide, please. These are steps 2 and 3 of the contextualization process. Next slide, please. Next slide. Great, thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much, Inbal.
Hi everyone, this is Fiona Shanahan from Trocaire, and I work on our protection of women and girls in emergencies work. And so I'm just going to share a few examples of our experience of using the minimum standards with partners. Would it be okay to move to the next slide, Sarah, please? Thank you very much. So maybe just the first story I want to share, perhaps before we get into this, maybe just to note that one thing I think to emphasize is that the minimum standards place very strong emphasis on partnering with local organizations and women-centered organizations, as others have mentioned, particularly women's movements, women's rights organizations in particular contexts. And so this focus is a really critical one, and the focus is on meaningful partnerships, that are grounded in participation and solidarity, local women's leadership, and a mutual respect for the expertise, needs, and feelings of the other within those partnerships. And so within that context, I'm going to just share a couple of moments of where we have used the minimum standards together with local partners, with local women-centered organizations, as a tool for improving implementation and improving practice and influencing others around GBV programming in emergencies. So the first example I wanted to share is from a project that we are doing together with the Global Women's Institute at George Washington University, and Elena Potts and Maureen Murphy there in particular. The GBV minimum standards task team, so many of the colleagues on the call today, Touch in South Sudan and KMSS in Myanmar. And so the focus of this project is to develop the M&E framework that will be a companion document to the minimum standards, and also to develop tools that are easily, and also to develop tools that are easily accessible, that are safe, ethical, and survivor-centered to measure the minimum standards indicators in GBV programs. So each standard has a short set of indicators, and you'll see those as you go through the standards. Most of these are indicators that you'll be familiar with. They're indicators that we're already using in GBV programming. But this project is trying to take a really strong focus on GBV response staff's perspectives and understanding how to make monitoring and evaluation systems and tools and indicators and processes more useful for them and more kind of accessible, culturally appropriate and safe for use in GBV programs. So there are a couple of things that we've been learning through this project. One big thing is that for local GBV response staff, so for example, thinking of our partners Touch in South Sudan, for GBV caseworkers and for psychosocial facilitators who are working in women and girls safe spaces and URL, M&E processes and M&E tools can sometimes feel quite extractive, something that you fill out and send away that doesn't necessarily have a very strong relationship to your programming or to your relationships with the women and girls who are using your programs. And so, you know, it's been a process of really listening to that and making sure that new tools that we're designing together resolve some of those difficulties and are a better fit. So using more story, for example, narratives, drawings, mapping, so things that we would use in some tools, now trying to use them more broadly across all our tools that we're developing. And so one other thing to mention on this was that there has been a global consultation that 193 different participants have been involved in, and over 50% of those have been from national NGOs or local CBOs. So we've had a really good level of participation in this project, and that's something we'd like to continue. So if you are interested in this project, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, or if you click the link there, you can see the project link and all our contact information is on there as well, if this is something you'd like to learn more about. So that's the first story, and if I can just move to the next slide, please, Sarah. I'll just share one more around our work in DRC. So this is an example from last December where we brought together partners working across the development and humanitarian programs with Trocaire in Ituri in DRC. And so this was an opportunity to come together and look at our strategy around our GBV prevention and response programming in Ituri. So the partners were Sophie Paddy, Fecond, FOMI, Caritas Wamba, and CDG Bunya. And we came together for a few days in Ituri in Bunya to really look at our strategy and to kind of collectively plan some ways forward over the coming year. And so one of the things that we did as part of that was take a real look at the minimum standards. And so the standards that were selected by partners to look at were those that were most relevant to their program. So health responses, psychosocial support, case management, women and girls safe spaces, referral systems, justice and legal aid, and collection and use of survivor data. So one of the things that we did was, first of all, kind of introduced and talked through the standards. Then we did some small group work looking at the standard language for each one, the standard indicators, the key actions. And then we did some work around kind of adapting the language in some of the key actions to make sure it was locally appropriate and relevant. For example, referencing national protocols or using kind of particular terms for women and girls safe spaces, for example. So then after that, we kind of discussed that in plenary and shared these revised key actions across all the standards and across the broader group. And then did a bit more around looking at what we were already doing in the program, what key actions maybe were receiving less attention or less priority, and then did a gallery walk after that phase of group work where people had an opportunity to reflect on their own programming within their own organization in relation to that, agree or disagree with different points that other groups had made, raise questions or add edits. So there was a real opportunity to kind of collaborate there and to strategize together. And so where we went from then was looking at what can be done to address maybe some of the key actions that were receiving less attention with our existing resources, and did a stakeholder analysis and some action planning around that. And then what would need additional resource mobilization, which then went into kind of the work of the next day that was really focusing on resource mobilization. So just to kind of share that quick example of a way of kind of bringing partners together, particularly who are working on similar programs in the same geographical area and doing that joint strategizing. And so if we could move to the last slide, please. So this example I wanted to share, and this is an experience from the Ghetto, work with the Ghetto Protection Cluster in Oh, sorry, I'm not sure what happened there. So this is from the Ghetto Protection Cluster. And so there was some work around the standard operating procedures for referral between organizations at the cluster level. And so colleagues had reached out around some support for reviewing and supporting that process to our colleagues in Trocaire and Ghetto. And so while I was there around the same time, we had a session that was just on one standard. And so we looked just at standard 14 on collection and use of survivor data. So what this did was brought all the different cluster members together, including with a particular focus on GBV response organizations. So organizations that were directly working on GBV response and prevention who were members of the protection cluster. Maybe just to note that at this time, the GBV subcluster wasn't activated in Ghetto. And so it kind of made sense to be having these conversations within the protection cluster. And so what we did really was spent a good bit of time just looking at that one standard. Really, first of all, what does the standard say? Kind of pulling out key quotes, particularly pulling out aspects around do no harm. So if you look at standard 14, there's kind of a number of boxes and areas within the text where particular do no harm issues are highlighted in relation to sharing information between agencies, including survivor data, and some of the guidance around how that information can be safely shared and what needs to be in place for that. And so we looked at the content of the standard, some of the do no harm issues. We gave quite a lot of time to reflection, discussion, thinking through to what extent those aspects were relevant in this context, thinking through some of the risks that might be there in Ghetto specifically around that. And then after kind of an hour and 15 minutes of really going in depth on the standard itself, we looked at key actions and kind of buzz groups around that. We also did some role play around sharing information outside your organization for service provision and secondly for coordination. And really one of the things, I think the value in giving really quite a lot of time to this one standard was that it allowed people to share some of their own pressures and concerns that might be driving practice that could potentially be harmful, either pressures coming from within their agency or from other agencies, and really allowing space to talk that through and reflect on some of that to build consensus and to bring people to a point where they're able to agree on kind of stronger, safer practices that align with the minimum standard. So I'll maybe just finish there, conscious of time, but perhaps just to say that I think, you know, some of these examples might give you a sense of the different kind of the variety and the different ways of using and engaging with the minimum standards, and how particularly they can be used to improve practice and demonstrate that to others, to collectively plan, strategize and influence, but also to speak truth to power to an extent. You know, this is a tool for GBV responders, but it can also be a tool for leadership, for funders, for decision makers, to hold each other to account and, you know, fundamentally to be accountable to women and girls and to people using our programs. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Fiona. Now we'll be hearing from UNHCR, I believe, or is it IOM?
Yes, if you can. This is Emilie from UNHCR. Thank you. So yeah, my name is Emilie and I'm the senior GBV officer with UNHCR based in headquarters. Very pleased to be with all of you today. So UNHCR, so the UN Refugee Agency, works with refugees, internally displaced persons, stateless persons, and returnees. And we just wanted to share a few words about our own experience also around the minimum standards, in particular in refugee settings. So UNHCR was involved from the beginning in the process for the development of the minimum standards at the global level, and then maybe unlike other guidance and so on developed by the GBV AOR that might focus in let's say non-refugee settings, there was an agreement really that those minimum standards are so fundamental that they are for sure also relevant in refugee settings where, as I'm sure many know already, we have a bit of a different coordination model that's called the refugee coordination model, and that's led by UNHCR. So, I mean, for example, I mean, if you're a GBV caseworker and you're providing case management in a refugee setting, I mean, the steps of case management, the standard that you would apply are for sure the same than in any other humanitarian settings. Same thing goes for ethical standard for data collection, for example. So basically, those standards are relevant equally in refugee settings. So UNHCR has, for example, recently released a GBV policy. It's the first time ever that we release a GBV policy, and they were very much guided by the minimum standard. And some of the key actions in particular were highlighted in the policy, but also in some of the accompanying documents. So that, if I give a few examples, the importance of, for example, engaging with women-led organization within both coordination structure, but also within GBV prevention and response programming was also integrated, because that's really one of the key action that we felt was really essential. Then, for example, we've also really emphasized the importance of ensuring that GBV prevention programs are accountable to women and girls. So that basically means that even if, for example, we work on a men and boy prevention, engaging men and boy in terms of GBV prevention, that the program itself has to be informed by women and girls. They are the expert of their own situation, and then throughout the program they should always be also feedback with women and girls. So those are just general example. And we are also reviewing our what we call result-based management framework. The indicators that are mentioned in the minimum standards also guided us in this review, especially some of the indicators on case management. So that was also very helpful, and I encourage the organization to really review and have a look at those indicators. And then we also for sure use the minimum standards whenever we were reviewing any kind of guidance or tools that we are working on, and ensure that those tools are in line with the minimum standards. That would also include training materials, for sure, for example. In terms of capacity development, so as raised by many other speakers today, I mean, in 2020, there was more an emphasis on familiarization with the minimum standards. We recently, in September, we did a training of trainer for UNHCR staff on GBV, and again, the minimum standards were very much used by the participants during their presentations, and so that covered 16 different operations. And then the plan is really in 2021 to really enhance those capacity development efforts and roll out the facilitation guide and the contextualization tool that Inbal just introduced to you now. And so this rollout, for sure, we will also focus on refugee settings. Next slide, please. So we know that many of you might also be working in refugee settings, so I'm sure you have your own examples, but those are just very quick snapshot of some of what we've done. So for example, in Thailand, the minimum standards were used in the context of a whole review of our protection strategies. And so that's also really key, because as UNHCR, we also want to focus more on prevention, really developing and enhancing our programs that are looking at transforming gender norms. So both in terms of engaging with men and boys to prevent GBV, but also invest more heavily in women and girls empowerment. So that was one example for the use of the minimum standards. We have also recently our colleague in Mali who have conducted training for GBV mobile teams in Menaka. So those are teams that also work with refugees who are coming from Niger. And so the training was focusing, was targeting a local partner, AMSS, Association Malienne pour la Survie au Sahel. And there was a strong emphasis on standard 1, so the guiding principles, to really give the GBV mobile team an overview of the key principles and especially the survivor-centered approach. And then standard 3 also were really important in terms of staff care, and I think that's also particularly important nowadays, where the current pandemic is also has also impacted GBV staff around the world. And then there was also an emphasis on standard 4 on health, and standard 14 on ethical data collection. And yeah, for sure, other standards were also covered, so covering psychosocial support, case management, referral system, women and girl safe spaces, and so on. But yeah, so that was an example of the use with a local partner. And for sure, we also encouraged UNHCR staff and partners to use the 16 days to further disseminate the minimum standards. So there are a number of contexts where colleagues are actually, as we speak, working on various awareness sessions and so on that integrate also the minimum standards. There are operations in Eastern Horn of Africa that have also developed communication materials, such as a notebook, for example, to disseminate or encourage people to be familiar with the minimum standards. And for sure, whenever we do a partnership agreement with organizations, we always refer to the importance of the minimum standards and their implementation as part of the GBV program. So we really encourage all actors working in refugee settings, but for sure also beyond, to use the minimum standards. They're extremely useful for GBV managers when you're planning a program, and they can and throughout the whole cycle of the program, and they can really help make a difference and ensure programs are survivor-centered and help us better protect women and girls. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emilie. Now we'd like to hear from Louise, and Louise is our last presenter. So if you have a question, please put it in the chat box.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. So my name is Louise O'Shea, and I am the GBV specialist with IOM based in Geneva. So just quickly before I start, just wanted to say a big thank you to the organization team for including IOM in this webinar. I think it's really important as a refresher on the minimum standards, particularly because of the global pandemic, and also because we're in the 16 days of activism period at the moment. Yeah, so I guess to kick off from IOM, we will be presenting on applying the minimum standards in displacement settings. And I think to frame the conversation, just to mention that GBV can be a defining feature of displacement. So both a driver in some contexts of displacement, and of course a consequence of displacement settings, and also people on the move. So really important to just highlight that to begin with. So of course we're working with IDPs alongside many organizations on the line, and I see a number of familiar faces, and so great to see such a high turnout. I mean familiar names, not faces. So we are working, of course, in some new emergency contexts, but also in more protracted settings. So it's important also to differentiate how the minimum standards might be contextualized for those different types of settings that we are all working in. Just similarly to what Emilie mentioned from UNHCR, IOM was very actively involved in the development and the review of the minimum standards, and continue to promote them across all the regions that we work. And also to note that the minimum standards were instrumental in also the development of our internal GBV in crisis framework, which is kind of our institutional policy on how we address GBV in crisis. So really just showing how influential the minimum standards have been. We always mention it within the document and our own internal policies, and reference it wherever we can. So I guess what we wanted to do was focus on how the minimum standards were ensured in some of the displacement settings that we work in IOM. So we decided to kind of really focus in on two of the standards that were most relevant to our work. So we chose women and girls participation and empowerment, which is of course standard 2, and safety and risk mitigation, which is standard 9. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Great, thank you so much. So this is the specific contextualization of standard 2, which is of course around participation and empowerment. So we chose to take a kind of more focused look at the Women's Participation Project, which is being implemented across different countries, but this specific example is from South Sudan, specifically Bentu in South Sudan. So from just a little bit of background on the Women's Participation Project, it's a dedicated program that we want to ensure the meaningful participation of women in both leadership, structures, and decision-making, but also ensuring that we have regular consultations, in this case with women's participation committees that were elected. So having regular consultations on the particular issues in day-to-day life in Bentu, and maybe some of the concerns that want to be raised in these forums. So this example is one of the consultations, highlighted some safety concerns around firewood collections in Bentu. So when women were going to collect firewood outside of the... Sorry about that. So when women were walking outside the protection of civilian sites, they were exposed to a lot of risk, and they raised this amongst the participation group. when we talk about participation and the Women's Participation Project, even from the name, you can see the linkage between the minimum standard on participation and empowerment. So linked to this, we engaged women in the response or in the solution. And one of the areas that came up was if we had fuel efficient stoves, it would reduce the number of times we had to leave the POC to collect firewood, as the firewood would last longer. So this was turned into a pilot project. And just to point out also how we linked it to a livelihood opportunity, as this was also a training on how to construct the fuel efficient stoves, and created livelihood for some of the participants of that workshop. So I guess when we're talking about contextualizing it, we're also looking at how the response was very specific to the needs of women and girls in the Bantu context. Next slide. Great, thank you. So the next standard we wanted to focus on was standard 9, which is, of course, safety and risk mitigation. And we really wanted to look at the context in Nigeria, because the team from IOM there are really doing a lot of work to integrate GBV risk mitigation measures within some of the other larger sectors that they're working in, including site planning, CCCM, doing site improvements, and WASH activities. So I guess looking at how did they do this? There was, of course, all of the other sectors in coordination with the GBV team were doing site observations when they would go to the field. So seeing what possible risks might face women and girls, doing multi-sectoral safety audits, which of course includes consultations and focus group discussions. So we can also see here the linkage between some of the standards, particularly the two that we have chosen. Of course, all of them are interlinked, but when we're talking about safety and risk mitigation, of course, it incorporates women's participation and women's meaningful engagement. So I guess some of the findings around this would have been that the location of services within the site are very, very important on mitigating risk, making sure that water points are not very far from the shelters so women and girls don't have to walk long distances, ensuring that sanitation facilities are gender segregated. So I just wanted to zone in a little bit on contextualizing this standard. One of the key areas is around coordination, which you have heard about in the contextualization tool. So I think this is something that we really need to look, we really need to highlight, because it involves the work of multiple sectors to kind of highlight the risks and mitigate them and address them also. Just as a last point from my side, there was also we wanted to highlight some of the how the minimum standard has guided some of the adaptations within our programming due to COVID, and how important this is. To not forget about, we have these minimum standards, they are existing. So even if we have to adapt our programming, we still need to keep them in mind. And this was a key area that we were working closely with field colleagues on. And some examples is remote consultations with women and girls in the Nigerian context. And also, I believe that their COVID messaging to the community has GBV considerations incorporated into that document, which will be rolled out with the community, including pictorial additions, so it's accessible to all. So just a few concrete examples on how the minimum standards have been contextualized in our work across different regions. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Louise. Now we have about 13 or 14 more minutes left to answer some of the questions that you've been putting in the chat. One of the first questions we got, I'd like to ask Emilie to weigh in if she can. How do the minimum standards interact with the MISP? Can you enlighten us a bit on that?
Sure. Thanks, Sarah, and thanks to all the presenters. Focusing on the MISP. The MISP, for those who might not know, it's the Minimum Initial Service Package for SRH in crisis settings. Standard 4, which is on healthcare for GBV survivors, speaks directly to the MISP, and the MISP is actually defined, the 6 objectives for the MISP is actually defined within that standard. It is also the second, I think, or first or second key action for that standard. The MISP has 6 objectives. There are 4 clinical objectives of the MISP, and the second one is about prevention and response to GBV, specifically focused on violence, treating sexual violence, and the healthcare response to sexual violence. So that is how it fits in with Standard 4. It also speaks to the links between GBV actors and health actors. And just want to quickly highlight that, a number of the key actions, obviously, or the standards, you don't go ahead until you have an assessment. You do not need to conduct an assessment before you do the MISP. So there's no needs assessment is available as outlined in the MISP. So you can just go ahead and implement it with led by health actors. So that's very important. And also to note that the MISP meets the SURF life-saving criteria as for healthcare programs in emergencies. So yeah, so it's in 4, so that is sort of integrated in the minimum standards within Standard 4.
Thanks so much, Emilie. And if any of the other speakers want to weigh in on that, feel free. Otherwise, I have another question, and this one I want to direct towards Inbal. So Inbal, one of the participants was curious, should GBV programs be audited regularly to see if they're maintaining the minimum standards? What's your thoughts on that?
I think it's great to be in a process of reflection and assessment of our programming. I would not say that the contextualization tool that is part of the GBV minimum standards is an audit per se. So it's more around how do we move our programming, how do we shift and improve our programming to fulfill the standards, and then based on whatever actions, whatever plan in the last step of contextualizing, the team decides to take to ensure that those actions are done. And then on a regular basis, it would be great to ensure that whatever programming components are being implemented are implemented according to the standard.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Do any of the other speakers want to weigh in on that? If not, my next question is for Fiona, I believe. People were very, very interested in the DRC case, and there was a number of questions about how you worked with that. How did you incentivize case managers? One of them wanted to know. And then there was also a question about how did the teams ensure that there was a survivor-centered perspective prioritized in the work in some of the places that you worked?
Sure, thanks very much. So perhaps to start with the ELRA project and kind of ensuring that there's a survivor-centered perspective as we develop the M&E framework and the M&E tools. So this has been really, really central to the work throughout, particularly around safety and ethics, but also around using kind of more participatory tools and methodologies. The main users for that project are the staff themselves, rather than program participants. And that's for a number of reasons, but ethics would be part of it. And so we're really foregrounding with psychosocial facilitators, GBV caseworkers, you know, really working with them around their knowledge and experience of what will work best for program participants and for including GBV survivors. And that's what's happening so far. And then once there are kind of sample tools ready to pilot, then we'll be piloting those with program participants and gathering their feedback at that stage. So that will be kind of piloting particular tools with small numbers of participants, and then gathering feedback around their perspective of the process, how they feel about certain questions or the process of gathering that information, and then further revising the tools again based on that. So again, really happy to engage offline as well if anyone is interested in hearing more about that project and in discussing further. And then in relation to the question around case management and referral in DRC, so there's a number of kind of really helpful tools and guidelines in addition to the minimum standards that are really helpful around GBV case management, particularly the GBV case management guidelines, which were published in 2017, and the Interagency GBV Case Management Guidelines training package as well. So that is in use in DRC, and that's been really helpful, as well as kind of organizations' own protocols and standards around GBV case management. And so that would include things like information sharing protocols, referral practices, and making sure that staff have support to do that. One of the big things I think in terms of any kind of quality measure with staff is around ensuring staff, like ongoing staff support and supervision. And so making sure that GBV caseworkers working in programs have access to supportive supervision, professional development opportunities, and a lot of ongoing training and capacity building to strengthen the quality of those services. And again, very happy to chat further about any of that as well.
Thanks a lot, Fiona. We have one more question, and then I think that's the last one that we have. Is there any room within the GBV standards to empower women by providing livelihood services? Can one of you respond to that?
Maybe I can jump in here. It's Louise from IOM. I think, yes, absolutely a great question. And of course, I think as a reminder, which was already mentioned in the beginning of the session, that we need to remember that these are just a minimum. We can always build on them, but these should be, you know, an adequate quality. But I think obviously within the guiding principles, we always need to follow the survivor-centered approach, but there's no reason, and within some of the other standards, which we mentioned also in our session on participation, on empowerment, these can lead to a lot of integrated programming within GBV and livelihoods. But of course, we need to also look at how we are designing projects and funding structures to see if that's prioritization within our own agencies. But there's definitely room, in my opinion, for these type of synergies. Over.
Thanks so much for that, Louise. And then Emilie, Inbal, and Catherine were also weighing in the chat over there that you can look through Standard 12 to look at livelihoods and economic empowerment. And Standard 11 also addresses cash and voucher assistance. So I know that the GBV AOR team has been working hard in the chat box to make sure that you know where to find everything on the website. So we'll be also circulating the PowerPoints, and if you want to join us on the GBV Community of Practice, all of our presenters, I believe, are members of the Community of Practice. And this is what we do over there. We chat with each other, we support each other, we share resources, we give each other ideas about how we can contextualize things to our different contexts. So really recommend that you come and join us. And on that note, we're going to close. But before we do that, we'd like you to answer a short poll for us that's going to be chatted into the, put into the chat box by Sarah Cornish-Spencer, just to give us a little more information. Because we're quite curious, since there's a lot of you there, have you used the GBV minimum standards before? And then we're also curious, do you feel more confident about using them and the contextualization tool in your setting? And what else do you need to roll out the minimum standards? One of the comments that I received in the chat box too was that it's not many of the small local organizations are really that familiar with it. So what can we do to reach them? Because we know that they're so central to our response. So please give us your thoughts and feedbacks into the poll over there on the humanitarian response that Sarah has put in the chat. And I'd like to also take this opportunity just to thank everyone for showing up on our webinar here, and to the Minimum Standards Task Team for all of their hard work that they've done in getting these out there for you, and to the GBV AOR colleagues, for especially our new communications colleague, Philippe, who's been working hard to make sure that during these 16 days of action, we have plenty of interesting things for you to join in on. So thank you all so very much for joining us. This will be shared on our GBV AOR website. You can go there to get recordings of all of our webinars that we do, and to download all the materials you need, and to get support either from our coordinators, our information management specialists, the help desk, or again, where I work on the community of practice. So thanks so much, everyone, and hope to see you in our next webinar on December 8th on staff care. Bye-bye.
Bye.